The professor stood at the front of the University of New Hampshire auditorium, his voice filled with unwavering confidence. "It's time we move beyond the myths that have held humanity back for centuries," he declared. "And one of the most enduring stories still shaping so many lives? Jesus. Let's be clear, Jesus is nothing more than a fairy tale." The room fell silent. Some students nodded in agreement, while others quietly jotted down notes. Caroline Leavitt, just 27 years old and the youngest White House press secretary in history, was on campus as a guest speaker, discussing Gen Z's role in politics. She carried both her Catholic faith and sharp Washington instincts with her. As she made her way through the hall, the professor's words unexpectedly reached her ears. Caroline stopped in her tracks, her hand tightening into a fist. She was no stranger to controversy. Working in the White House had prepared her for that. But hearing someone dismiss Jesus, the very foundation of her faith and values, as a mere fairy tale, that was something she couldn't just ignore. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. Professor Daniel Hargrove, a well-known progressive scholar, leaned forward on the podium, his hands pressed against the desk. His sharp gaze scanned the auditorium filled with students. "Now," he continued, his voice slicing through the air like a blade, "let's look at the facts. The tale of Jesus Christ, a man supposedly walking on water, turning water into wine, and even rising from the dead, is no different from Greek myths or Viking legends. There is no reliable historical proof that he existed as described in the Bible. It's a fabricated narrative, crafted to control the masses for centuries." The students remained still. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A girl in the front row scribbled furiously in her notebook, while a guy in the corner scrolled through his phone, barely paying attention. Hargrove smirked, relishing the weight of his words. "I understand this may be difficult for some of you to hear," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "But it's time we mature beyond fairy tales. Science and reason are the only true paths forward. Religion, especially the Jesus myth, is nothing more than outdated baggage from the past." He paused, letting his statement linger in the air, as if expecting applause. Instead, the auditorium doors clicked open. All heads turned. Standing there, poised and unwavering, was Caroline Leavitt. Dressed in a deep blue suit, her petite frame radiated an undeniable authority. Her eyes burned with an unshakable fire. Students murmured in hushed excitement. "Isn't she from the White House?" Hargrove's smirk faltered slightly, his expression twisting into mild annoyance. He tilted his head, clearly displeased by the interruption. Caroline exhaled slowly, then stepped forward. Each click of her heels against the wooden floor echoed like a silent declaration of war. She stopped midway down the aisle, fixing the professor with an unflinching stare. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm yet firm, carrying across the entire room. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just heard you called Jesus a fairy tale, and I have to say you're wrong." The room tensed. Students held their breath. Hargrove raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Oh, and who might you be?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Didn't expect a politician to take an interest in my history lecture. Are you here to defend this so-called myth?" Caroline didn't flinch. She stepped onto the podium, standing just feet away from Hargrove, her arms crossed with quiet confidence, the stance of a seasoned press secretary who had stood before the toughest media interrogations. "I'm not here to defend a myth," she replied, her voice sharp and unwavering. "I'm here to defend the truth. You say there's no evidence for Jesus? Then explain Tacitus, a Roman historian who is not a Christian, documenting Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate. Or Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, recording Jesus as a real figure who led a significant movement. These aren't biblical sources. These are independent historical records." A wave of murmurs rippled through the students. Some quickly pulled out their phones to fact-check. Hargrove's smirk returned as he crossed his arms. "You're Leavitt, right?" he said coolly. "I know you're a skilled spokesperson for Trump, But don't bring your political theatrics into my classroom. Those so-called sources, if they're even authentic, are just fragmented stories written decades after the fact. They prove nothing more than someone telling a good tale. Caroline tilted her head slightly, a glint of defiance in her eyes. A good tale, she echoed, sarcasm lacing her tone. Then why did that tale change the world? Why have billions lived and died following his teachings? You can call it a fairy tale all you want, but you can't erase Jesus's impact, whether historical or religious. Dismissing him completely? That's not intellectualism, it's arrogance. A single student clapped, then hesitated, unsure if anyone else would follow. Eyes flickered toward Hargrove, waiting for his reaction. The professor's expression darkened, his posture stiffening. "And who exactly do you think you are, Miss Leavitt?" he asked, his voice now edged with irritation. "A theologian? A historian? Or just another political mouthpiece, clinging to outdated ideas?" Caroline's lips curved into a smile, one devoid of warmth. "I'm someone who values truth," she stated, her tone as steady as steel. "And the truth is, you just dismissed millions of people, including me, by calling Jesus a fiction, without presenting a strong enough argument to back it up. If you want a real debate, I'm ready." The University of New Hampshire auditorium had transformed into an intellectual battleground. Professor Hargrove stood firm at the podium, his arms crossed, his sharp eyes locked onto Caroline. Across the room, students leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide. Some had already started recording, unwilling to miss a second of what was unfolding before them. Caroline, still standing in the aisle, met his glare head-on. The air between them crackled, waiting for the next spark. Hargrove was the first to break the silence, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Miss Leavitt," he drawled, "do you really think you can just walk in here and lecture me? You believe a couple of mentions from Tacitus or Josephus somehow prove Jesus' existence. That's disappointing from someone who claims to be informed." He shook his head, as if scolding a naive student. Caroline's eyes flashed with defiance. "Disappointing," she repeated, her voice laced with mockery. "I don't need you to tell me what's true. The real disappointment is seeing someone dismiss facts simply because they don't fit their worldview. I was raised Catholic, played softball in New Hampshire, and learned to question everything. That's exactly why I stand here today, not just for my faith but for the truth." A student hesitated before raising a hand. "Miss Leavitt," he asked, his voice uncertain, "do you actually believe in the miracle stories?" The room fell silent again, all eyes on Caroline. She smiled, this time genuinely. "Great question," she said, her tone softening. "I believe in the power of Jesus's ideas, love, forgiveness, sacrifice. As for miracles, that's a personal decision. But don't let anyone tell you Jesus didn't exist. His influence on history isn't a fairy tale, it's fact." Hargrove let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ideas, huh?" he scoffed, turning a fictional figure into a political symbol. "Classic. I know this game. You learned it from Trump, didn't you?" Caroline's smile faded. "You talk about facts," she said, her voice rising, "but the fact is, you just insulted millions by calling Jesus a myth without presenting real proof of your own." And with that, the debate had only just begun.